Right, so we are going to be ranking every single Melee DPS spec based on their difficulty, from easiest to hardest down here. And I reckon that I've got some controversial takes, so prepare yourselves. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the Melee today, and then we'll do the ranged on Sunday. But with the ranged, we'll add on to the Melee tier list that we've already got. So then we'll create a complete DPS difficulty tier list, right? Got it? Good. Right, so first up, we have the Havoc Demon Hunter. And I actually think that this spec is a lot harder than people give it credit for. At its base rotation, it's quite easy. You're pressing your Blade Dance off a cooldown, you're spamming your Chaos Strikes, pressing your Glaive Tempest off cooldown. But the difficulty is with your momentum or inertia windows. It's all movement based, which is very, very difficult, especially in harder content when you're zip zapping through all of these mechanics and swirlies that will one-shot you. And they do one-shot me. So personally, I don't know if it's a skill issue for me, but I do find the Havoc Demon Hunter as quite a more complex spec, especially for newer players. I think this would be a very hard spec to pick up and learn, because these damage windows that you gain from your momentum or inertia are also very short windows. So you've also got to lean all of your bursty damage into these little windows here. So yeah, it's a difficult one, I think, for Havoc. They also have lots of little cooldowns that you need to line up, and like your Essence Break combo is quite tricky to pull off. I know that I've missed Essence Break a few times, and then you got to hit your Blade Dance into that, then meta into another Blade Dance. I think that gets a little bit skewed with these new hero talents, but that was the old sort of combo that you had to execute, and it's not the easiest. So then we have Aldrachi Reaver, which adds Throw Glaive into your rotation. Not too difficult, it's only one extra button press, right? But then you do have to make the decisions after you throw this glaive to which ability you want to empower first, whether it's your Blade Dance or your Chaos Strike. Makes for a fun little mini game, but there is some complexity there. If you do press the wrong button, then you are going to lose some DPS from that. With Felscard, I'm not too sure on how it actually interacts with your rotation, but like I was saying with the Essence Break combo just then, the problem is now with Felscard, when you I-beam, you're getting your empowered Blade Dance and Sigil of Flame maybe. So you want to use those first before you then go into meta, which is kind of jumbling up what used to be the go-to rotation for the Havoc Demon Hunter. So that's going to be new. It's something we got to figure out. I think mainly because of the movement-based gameplay, I think that is the biggest perpetrator in how hard this spec is. I'm going to put Havoc in the hardest here. Next, we have the Enhancement Shaman, which I think might be the hardest spec in the game. You do have the Storm build, which is maybe one of the easiest specs in the game. So it's kind of hard to rank it as an overall spec, but considering the Elementalist build has kind of been the go-to over these previous seasons and expansions, I'm going to be ranking it off of that. The Elementalist build has the most things going on out of any spec in the game. You got to keep up your Flame Shock maintenance. You then got to spread these Flame Shocks. You then have to spread your Lava Lashes to buff up the damage of those Flame Shocks. So this is just your Flame Shocks. With Hailstorm and Ice Strike, you've got to weave in Ice Strikes and Hailstorms in between every single spender, because you can overcap on your spenders to actually get your Hailstorm off in between each spend. See, it's confusing even bloody explaining it. There is just so many different plates and buffs to spin with this spec. What else is there? I'm missing something. You got your Prim Wave as well, which is another cooldown that you need to manage. It's on a 30-second cooldown now, so that's coming around even quicker. With your Lava Lash spreading as well, you need to be making sure that you're maintaining your Crash Lightning buff as well to be cleaving your Lava Lashes and your Storm Strikes, though Storm Strike isn't that relevant with this build. So yeah, there is a lot going on. All while you are also a melee spec with tons of CC that you need to use. Totemic makes this even more complicated because you have to babysit a totem. Every single ability that you press in the enhancement rotation is impactful in itself, but then you play Totemic and every single button press is now affecting that totem, or the totem is affecting that button press. For instance, you can get cooldown reduction on your Sundering or your Elemental Blast. So there's a lot going on. Stormbringer makes you want to press your Lightning Bolt in AoE, so that feels a little bit tricky to get used to at first, but I mean, if you see your Tempest proc, you know to press your Lightning Bolt keybind. It's just something that could maybe confuse a few people. And then the only other thing, I'm not sure on this myself, which I guess kind of proves that it isn't the most difficult spec in the game. Do you use your free chain lightnings on enhancement when you're playing Stormbringer? Because you're not building Maelstrom then, which is what you want to do. You want to be churning through as many Maelstrom weapon stacks as you can. But if you're pressing these free chain lightnings, you're not doing that. No questions asked. Enhance is going at the top of the hardest here. I don't think anything else is going to come close to it. Does it need its own tier? I don't know, but definitely one of the hardest specs in the game. Oh, that's it as well. You now also, with the Stormbringer, you also need to tab target to spread your lightning rods. So there's even more tab targeting that needs to be done. Next up, we have the Feral Druid. Now, Feral Druid, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it is still the only spec in the game that actually makes use of your snapshotting. I think that is the case. So if you guys don't know what snapshotting is, it's basically if you apply a rake with no buffs, it would do 10 damage. If you then use Tiger's Fury and then apply a rake, it would do extra damage because of the damage bonus from your Tiger's Fury. Even if your Tiger's Fury falls off, it will do the increased damage for the whole duration of that dot. So that, coupled with the fact that this is mainly a dot spec, I think dot specs in general are just inherently harder because of the maintenance of keeping up the dots, makes this spec quite difficult to a newer player. I also think, now this is a weird one, but hear me out. I think Feral might be harder now, slightly. Because in AoE, in Dragonflight, your AoE spender was your Primal Wrath, right? You could choose to bite, but let's forget that for now. Your AoE spender was primarily your Primal Wrath. So your rip was always being just passively refreshed through your rotation. In the War Within, that's changing. You're now keeping up your rip as a maintenance debuff on the target, and then you're using your combo points to spend Ferocious Bites into your main target that's also going to cleave with Rampant Ferocity. So you have to keep an extra eye and be more aware of your rip timers now, because they're not just being passively reapplied. There's something you actually have to think about now. And that actually gets quite tricky. Circle of Life and Death, coupled with the massively slower energy regeneration that we get in the War Within, kind of makes it so that you're really going to have to think about pooling some energy to make sure that your rip is never falling off the target. Because rip, I feel like it's been buffed. It's doing a lot of damage overall, but you're not spamming it. The slower energy regen also impacts another min-maxy, but almost necessary part of the gameplay for Feral, where you have to wait for extra energy to consume that with your Ferocious Bites to deal extra damage. So yeah, there's just a lot of slow energy regeneration going on that is quite heavily affecting the rest of your gameplay. Druid of the Claw doesn't really make the rotation any more difficult, it just replaces your Ferocious Bite. Wildstalker, however, you do want to be either tab targeting or preferably clicking on your targets that have vines on them, the targets that you've spawned your vines on, so then you can bite them to explode that damage into AoE. So that is definitely going to make the spec a little bit more complex as well. Feral is definitely on the harder side of the DPS specs. I'm going to place this one above the Havoc Demon Hunter. It feels weird that I'm saying above, but obviously that being above means it's closer to the hardest here. Next up, we have some easier specs. I think arms is quite easy to pick up and go with. Like, all of your buttons do a lot of damage. That's kind of the whole fancy of the arms playstyle. The main thing that you need to maintain and do is keep up and apply your rends to most targets. If it's mass AoE, you're going to struggle to do that. In the general sense, you want to be applying your rends, and then you can get into your rotations where you're lining up all of your burst damage into those Colossus Smash cooldowns, or windows, I should say. Kind of easy in itself. Rend is not a big deal, to be honest, in terms of like difficulty. There is, however, a big problem with arms with cooldown alignment. So when you charge into the pack, put all of your cooldowns together, of course, that's fine. But then what you're going to notice is all of your cooldowns are coming back at different times. So you're going to have to start questioning, like, okay, am I going to wait for this Warbreaker to come back to pair it up with my Blade Storm? My Thunderous Roar needs to go on cooldown now, so I've got it again in 45 seconds on my avatar. There's a lot of cooldown management because the spec is kind of in a weird spot right now with its cooldown alignment. So that, I think, makes it a little bit more difficult. On top of that, you do have some buff windows. So after your Blade Storm, you're going to get a Merciless Bone Grinder buff, which increases the damage of your Whirlwind and Cleave. So you need to take advantage of this window. You're going to lose a lot of DPS if you're not spamming your cleave and whirlwind as many times as you can during this window. Granted, they are on cooldown, but you need to do one at the start of it and one at the end, depending on which ability you're using. So there's room to lose a lot of damage in that window too. But apart from that, the rotation, I feel, kind of plays itself. Abilities just kind of naturally come off cooldown. Press cleave, you're pressing overpowers, you're pressing mortal strikes, pressing your 2 executes before your mortal strikes inside your execute window. But once you kind of learn that muscle memory, you're good to go. With Slayer, you're getting more frequent blade storms. So again, it's that cooldown management of if I'm going to send my blade storm off the rip every single time, or if I'm going to wait to pair it up with a warbreaker or something like that, which is, I think, is the ideal move there. For Colossus, you've got your new Demolish ability. Make sure that you have sweeping strikes up every time when you're pressing Demolish, because it is going to cleave on a second target. And then also use your next Demolish before your Colossal Might buff runs out. I've been guilty of missing that buff window a few times myself. All that being said, I feel like I did make arms sound a lot more complex than it is. I'm going to put arms in the easier tier. Well, we're going to move on to Fury now. Fury is definitely the easier of the two. It is stupidly fast-paced, so it is quite physically demanding. If you've got any wrist or joint issues, it might be demanding in that sense, but it's not mentally demanding. The Fury Warrior is just as button mashy as it can be. It's just your typical builder spender profile, but on crack. It's a very, very, very fast-paced gameplay. It can be punishing if you don't keep up your meat cleaver stacks, which is when you press your whirlwind, it makes your next abilities cleave on up to 5 targets, I think. You definitely want to be maintaining that buff in AoE, otherwise you're going to lose a lot of damage. With Mountain Thane, basically all you have to do is replace your replace your whirlwind with Thunderclap. So you're now going to be pressing Thunderclap instead of whirlwind, because that's going to give you the cleaving on your next 4 abilities. So that's pretty easy. Mountain Thanes, yeah, there's not really much else going on there. You can min-max with this spec with the Fury Warrior with talents like Fresh Meat. You can tab target or swap targets with your Bloodthirst to gain a guaranteed enrage window. Very min-maxy, but there is room for that. But overall, the Fury Warrior is one of the easier specs in the game, I do believe. Well, we'll move on to Asa then, which I have very different opinions on. Right, so we know that I am no expert when it comes to Asa and Sub, but I think there is reason and merit to that. I can play most of the DPS specs in the game at a good level. These two are quite complicated to learn, and I don't think anyone can really argue with that. I would say Assassination is the hardest of the rogue specs in my opinion. It's a dot spec, again, inherently just makes it harder. You're spreading those garrotes, you're vanishing to spread those garrotes and ruptures. There's a lot going on. In between that, you need to maintain Caustic Spatter on your main target to splash damage off of that, as well as maintaining your Crimson Tempest on all the mobs around you. So there is a lot of dot maintenance to upkeep here. On top of that, you also need to shiv at the right times. I feel like that might be kind of self-explanatory once you learn the spec. And you also need to Thistlety at the right times. I hate Thistlety, so maybe that's why I find it like quite a clunky mechanic. Yeah, there's just a lot of plates to spin, a lot of buffs to press at the right time. Your energy regen, not so much on AoE, but on single target, you have to pull the energy at the right time so you've got the maximum damage inside of windows. I think generally it is a hard spec. It's a lot of work. I think it's satisfying, but this isn't a case of satisfying, right? It's a case of how hard are they, how much work are they to actually play. With your Deathstalker hero talent, it's kind of the only hero talent that really affects your gameplay. It then kind of jumbles up your priorities even more, because now you want to ambush inside your stealth windows. So you've got that extra thing to think about to weigh up against garroting inside your stealth windows, which is a lot of your damage when it comes to the Asa Rogue. So I'm sure there is a priority over the other there, but that is just very, very complicated, and either one you press there is going to feel bad. So for the Asa Rogue, I am going to put this in the hardest tier. It's not as hard as Enhanced, but I do think it's one of the hardest specs in the game. Okay, moving on to Subtlety Rogue. I was going to put this in the harder tier, but I think it might have to go in the hardest as well. This spec is difficult due to the insane amount of button bloat in your rotation, specifically your opener. I think you have something like 9 different cooldowns to press in your opener. Feels horrible for one, but I feel like I need to be a bloody pianist to actually execute my opening rotation. I don't know how people don't do it without macros to bind stuff together. I don't have the brain power to execute the sub rotation, let alone the key bindings. This spec can also be very punishing if you do mess up your Shadow Dance windows, so you can lose a lot of damage from that. Yeah, I think sub's going to go in the hardest here. What makes this even harder is the newer Dance Macabre talent. That's a confusing talent. It's going to put off a lot of new people, and it's quite hard to execute. So yeah, there's just a lot going on with sub. It definitely, in my opinion, needs to be dumbed down a little bit. And then outside of your Shadow Dance rotation, there's no rest for the Wicked, okay? You're then going to be spreading your Ruptures, and you're also going to be maintaining your Slice and Dice, spending those combo points to get back into your Shadow Dance windows. The only thing I will say for sub is it is, outside of the Dance Macabre talent, it is kind of simple to play in the fact that like you almost press one builder button, which is your Shadow Strike or Shuriken Storm, and then you spend with a Black Powder, Eviscerate, or Secret Technique if it's off cooldown. You do have to press your Secret Technique at the right time with the Dance Macabre, so that does make it harder. At its core gameplay, it is your basic builder and spender. Does that make sense? I don't know. And then we have Trickster for the other one. I don't think much goes on with Trickster, so we're going to put the Subtlety Rogue in the hardest tier as well. I do think Asa is harder personally because it's mainly a dot spec, but I think you could probably interchange those two. Yeah, that's a good point as well. Invigorating Shadow Dust. I don't take that talent when I play sub, when I've played sub, because that makes everything seem a lot more complicated. You get massive CDR. Yeah, that's just scary. I mean, maybe sub is harder than Asa. I don't know. We'll keep them next to each other, okay? We have the Outlaw Rogue. Now, this is where, you know earlier how I said I have some controversial takes? This might be my controversial take of the day. I don't think Outlaw's that hard. I think Outlaw is a relatively easy spec. It's very, very fast paced, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a hard spec, okay? The only thing that I will give it credit for, give credit where it's due, crack shot windows are very punishing if you do mess up your between the eyes. You want to be pressing your between your eyes inside your stealth and subterfuge and vanish windows, because then it doesn't go on cooldown. You get loads and loads more damage from doing this correctly. So if you do mess that up, which I think maybe new players probably will mess that up at first, that can be very punishing, and it does make the spec harder. I'm not saying this is a turbo easy spec. A lot of people rate Outlaw as a really, really hard spec, and I don't think it is. It's a builder and spender playstyle. Your single target to AoE rotation doesn't really change. You have maintenance buffs in Blade Flurry, Slice and Dice, and also your Roll the Bones. But I mean, they're all kind of long durations anyway. You're pressing Blade Flurry in AoE to build combo points as well, so they're kind of like naturally going to be up anyway. I'm going to put the Outlaw Rogue in the middle tier. I think it's very, very hard done by a lot of people that say it's a really, really hard spec. But I think at its core, I think you can jump on the Outlaw Rogue and do respectable damage pretty quickly. Like, I really don't think the rotation is too difficult. Moving on, we have the Survival Hunter. Now, obviously, Survival has changed a lot going into the War Within. We've had a massive overhaul to it. Most of your damage is coming from your Wildfire Bombs and your Explosive Shots. So as long as you press those two buttons, you're going to be doing a lot of damage. The complexity from this spec comes from weaving in your kill commands in between your biggest button presses. For those that don't know, kill command gives you a tip of the spear buff, which increases the damage of your next ability. So you want to make sure that you have this buff on your hardest hitting abilities, your Wildfire Bombs, your Explosive Shots, your kill shots, etc, etc. So there is a little bit of complexity there with weaving in those kill commands in between every single ability. And this can get overwhelming in AoE. There is so many procs and overcapping of charges. This is just how the spec plays. It's no fault of anyone's. It becomes very convoluted with which buttons you should be pressing because you're capped on Wildfire Bombs. You've got an Explosive Shot off cooldown. Your Butchery is capped on stacks. Maybe you've got a proc of Cleaving Mongoose Bite from that talent. Merciless Strikes, is it called? Maybe you've also got a proc from your Sikkim, which makes your kill shot cleave as well. There's a lot going on, and you will have to learn the priority. And I think that the problem here is the design of the spec. I think Blizz will eventually get it right, and they've gone in the right direction. But I think in AoE, there is quite a big problem with that. So that can be definitely a little complex. To compensate for that, though, Your main cooldown is now completely dumbed down. For those of you that played survival before, you needed like 2 different macros to actually get your coordinated assault cooldown to actually work properly, because you wanted to turn your pet's basic attacks off. That is no longer the case. It's just a pure damage buff. So that's an easy cooldown. It's on a minute cooldown as well if you talent into it, so you can just kind of send that and forget and just send it on cooldown. Not too much to worry about there. With the other talent though, that doesn't make it a 1 minute cooldown, you do generate extra stacks of tip of the spear. So you want to make sure that you're pressing 2 extra abilities that aren't kill command in between every kill command, because you don't want to end up over capping on your tip of the spear buff. So again, little bits of extra complexity here and there. The hero talents I don't think change anything. I don't think they interact with the way you press your buttons at all. So I'm going to place the survival hunter in the mid tier. So this is closer to the hardest tier. It's harder than Outlaw. Moving on then, we have the Unholy Death Knight, which has actually become quite a bit easier coming into the War Within. There's a lot less button bloat now, so your opener is a lot less bloated. Your Unholy Blight is now a passive that is tied to your Dark Transformation, so you no longer have to press Unholy Blight, and you also don't have to press Virulent Plague, because your Dark Transformation is going to apply your diseases for you. So that makes the opener a lot easier, okay? When you get into your rotation, applying your wounds in an AoE manner, maybe you have to target your wounds, can be a little bit difficult. This is made a lot easier by the introduction of your Festering Scythe talent, but I would still say that making sure you've got wounds up on multiple mobs to then pop with your Cleaving Scourge Strikes could add a little bit of depth to the spec. Once you kind of got the hang of that and once you're in the swing of it, then it just kind of becomes a little dance between not overcapping runic power by using your Epidemic and Death Coil to spend your runic power, and then using your Scourge Strike to cleave and pop your wounds, and maybe pressing your Festering Strike to apply wounds if you don't have any. Your cooldowns also line up a lot nicer now. You've got 2 45-second cooldowns in Dark Transform and Apocalypse, and then you've got your bigger cooldowns, Unholy Assault and Raise A-Bomb, on a 1.5 minute cooldown. They play themselves. You press your APOC and Dark Transformation pretty much on cooldown, and then you can line that up with all of your other cooldowns at the same time. So you don't really have to do any thinkings with your cooldowns, which is nice. Sand Lane. The only thing that you do have to be very aware of here is your Vampiric Strike. Every so often, it's going to consume your main disease, which is your Virulent Plague, to deal burst damage, but it is going to consume your disease. So make sure that you're keeping an eye on that, because it's going to fall off a lot quicker than you're expecting it to. And if you're kind of just looking, I know a lot of people will use a weak aura, but if you're looking at your frames and seeing your Blood Plague and Frost Fever, that doesn't necessarily mean that your Virulent Plague is on there, because your Vampiric Strike might have consumed it. Rider of the Apocalypse, pretty passive in general. You do get extra free Death and Decays, which means that you don't necessarily have to throw down your Defile. I think you would anyway, actually, because Defile kind of slaps by itself, so maybe that's not even that relevant. And then you're kind of just popping your Trollbane's Icy Fury passively anyway with your Cleaving Scourge Strike, so there's not too much depth there with the Rider of the Apocalypse hero talent. I'm going to put the Unholy in the mid tier as well. I'm going to put this just behind Survival, so this is kind of slap bang in the middle of the difficulty, in my opinion. Same class, we've got the Frost Death Knight, definitely the easier of the two. Frost is pretty much still its simple self, applying diseases and then mashing Obliterates with your Death and Decay down, and then not overcapping by spending on Frost Strike. It is quite punishing if you do mess up your Death and Decay windows, so I will add some complexity points to it there, though it's not really too hard of a mechanic to understand and execute. Just stand in your Death and Decay. It's become easier now because you get a 4-second grace period after you leave your Death and Decay as well. So that's a lot easier in general. With the Frost rework and the new talents, a lot of your tree is actually coming from, it's actually buffing your auto attacks as well. So, I mean, that is just free damage. You don't even really have to think about it. I don't actually know if people do this, but there is an argument for tab targeting with your Frost Strike to consume your Razor Ice stacks for extra damage. I don't really think that's a massive gain in DPS. I could be wrong. That's a little bit of min-maxing you can do, but generally the spec is very, very simple. That's more so for the Obliterate side of things, which I think is the way that Frost is going to go. If you play Breath of Sindragosa, it's definitely going to get a little bit harder, though I do think with the new talents you gained coming into the War Within, you're generating just a lot more runic power in general, so the upkeep of your Breath of Sindragosa is probably a lot easier than it used to be. Rider, again, very passive, but I do think the Death and Decay from Mograine is much more impactful for Frost. It kind of bridges that gap for when you don't have Death and Decay. So if you see that, try and take advantage of it and slam your Obliterates inside his Death and Decay so you can save yours. But obviously, don't overcap on yours because then you're wasting damage. What's the other one? Deathbringer, again, very passive. Doesn't really affect your gameplay too much. Just remember to apply your Reaper's Mark. Frost is very easy. It's going to go in the easiest here. I think because of the complexity from Death and Decay, I'm going to put it behind Fury. And also you've got the Breath of Sindragosa build as well, so that could add some difficulty to it as well. So penultimately, that was a big word, wasn't it? For the melees, we have the Windwalker. Now, at first glance, I think that the mastery for Windwalker could be quite off-putting, and before you even get into your rotation, there's something to think about, right? With never pressing the same ability twice if you don't know what the mastery is. You've always got to change the ability that you're pressing. So I don't know how much that's going to influence where I'm going to place this, but it is something that people need to consider, right? Other masteries include just increased damage that you do not have to think about at all. Windwalker is a very priority-based spec with cooldowns constantly coming off of cooldowns, so you constantly need to be aware of what your next button press is on top of the mastery that we were just then talking about. There is a lot of like weighing up which button you need to press, which I do think makes it just difficult by itself anyway. They have, however, reduced a lot of button bloat. So you're saying bye-bye to Chi Wave, Chi Burst, Expel Harm, and also Bone Dust Brew, W. Thank you, Blizzard. You don't have to even think about pressing these buttons anymore. I don't think Chi Burst is not an active button press for Windwalker, is it? Okay, so Chi Burst is an active, my bad, but they've got rid of Chi Wave, Expel Harm, and Bone Dust Brew. The only other thing I'll say for the core rotation of the Windwalker is just make sure you press Strike of the Windlord before your big damaging cooldowns and buttons, because it's going to echo all of the damage. Just make sure that you press that before all your buttons, otherwise you'll be losing out a lot of damage from that. So, Conduit of the Celestials, easy to play with, but you do have to be very aware of, I mean, when you press your Unity Within button, all 4 of the Celestials are going to spawn, but also when you get your Yulon procs as well, your Fist of Fury is going to have an increased speed on its channel, so prepare for that and don't just be sat there like a lemon after that goes off because you think that you're still channeling that. And also it's going to heavily reduce the cooldown of your Fist of Fury as well, so just be aware because that's going to make it harder to press your Whirling Dragon Punch, but they have added a slight grace period for that. So when you press your Fist of Fury and you've got your Rising Sun Kick, you want to get that Whirling Dragon Punch off ASAP just to guarantee that you can press it, okay? Because Fist of Fury comes back very quickly with Conduit of the Celestials. And Shadowpan, nothing changes because it's a bloody boring hero talent. So for the Windwalker, I'm going to place this in the mid tier. It's going to go in the mid tier. I think on the easier side of the mid tier. I don't know, man. I would say that Windwalker is harder to play than Outlaw at a base level, but there's lots more to min-max with Outlaw. So I think you could interchange these two. We'll do this because the Outlaw has the punishing aspects of its rotation from your crackshot windows. We'll say that Windwalker is easier than it, okay? And lastly, we have the Ret Paladin. Does anybody have any guesses where the Ret Paladin is going to go? Arguably the easiest spec in the game. I know that people will fight me on BM Hunter on that, but we'll do the range video on Sunday, okay? We'll see where that ends up. Rets become even more simple going into the War Within because you can take the talent Radiant Glory, which bakes your wings into your Wake of Ashes. Somehow this spec's just getting even easier. I don't get it. You now got wings on a 30-second cooldown. You just press Wake of Ashes and you do your big cooldown at the same time. You press your Final Reckoning with every other one because that's on a 1-minute cooldown. There is 0 cooldown management there. There is 0 button management with Ret as well. I'm joking. There's a little bit of complexity and priority system to the Ret Paladin, but generally you're just building up your holy power and spending it with Divine Storm on 2+ targets. Judge, Jury, Executioner. I don't know if that's a new talent. I've definitely never seen it before, but basically it makes it so that your final verdict will cleave on an additional 3 targets. So there is some buffs that you need to maintain, or no, not that you need to maintain, but keep an eye on. If you get this buff, you want to be pressing your final verdict because it trucks. It's not like, okay, who am I kidding? It is insanely easy, isn't it? Templar just means that you press Wake of Ashes more. It replaces your Wake of Ashes with Hammer of Light, which, by the way, is an amazing feeling button, but that's not what this tier list is about. You're just pressing your Wake of Ash more. When that lights up, you press it, and then it becomes free after spending 60 Empyrean Hammers. There's probably, with good gameplay, you could probably min-max the amount of hammers that you generate with your Shake the Heavens buff, but for the most part, you kind of just generate these hammers anyway, so that's just going to happen naturally, and you're going to get more Hammers of Light that deal more big damage. Herald of the Sun does require some slight positioning awareness, because you want these beams to be firing through all of the enemies, and as an added bonus, maybe your teammates as well, to get some passive healing on them. That's all you really need to be aware of for Herald of the Sun. You get a guaranteed Divine Purpose proc after you press your Wake of Ashes, because Wake of Ashes is the only important part in your rotation apparently these days. So be aware that you need to spend 2 spenders and don't overcap on Holy Power with that. I think that's all I need to say for Ret Paladin. For the melee tier list, easiest to hardest is going to go at the easiest. So we've got Ret Paladin at the top alongside Fury Warrior and Frost DK. I think there's not too many questions to be asked there, is there? They are the easiest melees in the game. And then the hardest specs, we have 2 of the rogue specs, and then obviously the Enhancement Shaman. Let me know down in the comments below if you agree with this tier list, and the ranged tier list will be being added onto this tier list, so eventually we'll have all of the DPS ranked against each other in terms of difficulty. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.